Wake everybody up. Good morning. Let's get started. Thanks for being with us today. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of East Aurora. I'm Keith Owens, and I'll be your service leader this morning. We're happy to welcome all visitors, as well as our virtual audience on Zoom. Our friend Lauren Becker is back with us this morning. So this talk was actually ready to go, and it was postponed at the very last minute from last October, so I didn't have to rewrite anything. So fall is in the air. The election is looking pretty scary, and the Bills are doing great, and I'm sure they're headed for the Super Bowl this year. Probably should have updated that part. And we have Jenny Mombrea on the piano for us. And before we get started, suppose we all just stand up for a minute and extend a warm UU greeting to the folks around you. So let's go ahead and get started. Do we have any announcements? You come up, watch the HDMI cord here.
Hi, I'm Judy Gear. I am a proud feminist, so I am glad that Lauren is here today, and this is a great time to announce this. I just heard yesterday Walgreens drugstore is being very bad. They are refusing to sell the abortion medication, even though it is still legal. So they don't like us, we won't like them. So we are asking, there is a national movement to boycott Walgreens. So that's my ask.
Hi, everybody. Just a reminder that Reverend Tina is here to do a class after service for anyone who's interested in being a service leader, anyone who's been a service leader for a long time and wants to share their wisdom within the class. That's welcome and invited to. So it'll be right after you grab your coffee, come back in the sanctuary. Thank you.
Any more announcements? This is the time to enter into the silence as we listen to our pianist Jenny play the prelude. Let us read in unison the chalice lighting as printed in your order of service. We light this candle in remembrance of all of our predecessors who lit the lamp of knowledge to dispel the darkness of ignorance and superstition. For today's opening words, I got to thinking about, this is more about democracy in general, I guess. I was going to dig out something inspirational and wholesome, but Lauren usually takes care of that, so I'm free to just do stand-up comedy. And so I want to read you hands down, my favorite story about democracy. It's from Douglas Adams, the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, as some of you might know. It's a classic, hilarious science fiction parody. This is from one of the sequels, which is called So Long and Thanks for All the Fish. In the book, a giant UFO lands on the Earth, and a scary robot gets out and says, "I come in peace. Take me to your lizard." This confuses everyone. But one of the characters happens to be an experienced space traveler. His name is Ford. and he explains it to his earthling friend Arthur. It comes from a very ancient democracy, you see. You mean it comes from a world of lizards? No, said Ford, who by this time was a little more rational and coherent than he had been, having finally had the coffee forced down him. Nothing so simple, nothing anything like so straightforward. In this world, the people are people, the leaders are lizards. The people hate the lizards, and the lizards rule the people. Odd, said Arthur. I thought you said it was a democracy. I did, said Ford. It is. So, said Arthur, hoping he wasn't sounding ridiculously obtuse, why don't people get rid of the lizards? It honestly doesn't occur to them, said Ford. They've all got the vote, so they pretty much assume that the government they voted in more or less approximates to the government they want. You mean they actually vote for the lizards? Oh yes, said Ford with a shrug. Of course. But, said Arthur, going for the big one again, why? Because if they didn't vote for a lizard, said Ford, the wrong lizard might get in. Timeless wisdom. Our church is supported by gifts from members and friends. We will now receive the morning offering, and the way we do this is the plates are in back, and you can feel free to drop something in as you are so moved or as you leave after the service. In the meantime, Jenny will play for us George Harrison's All Things Must Pass. And we have a storytime video for the kids and adults today. It's The Worry Box by Suzanne Chu.
Welcome to Story Time with Miss LaPerry. Today's story is The Worry Box, written and illustrated by Suzanne Chu and Sean Julian. High up on his thinking spot, Murray Bear looked across the valley. "Here you are," called his sister Millie. "It's time for lunch." "I'm not hungry," Murray sighed. "You're always hungry," giggled Millie. "Come on, or we'll be late meeting Alfie at the waterfall." "I don't want to go," snuffled Murray. "What if the waterfall's too loud? What if it's so big that I get whooshed away?" Millie squeezed Murray tight. "Waterfalls are big and loud," she said, "but they're also beautiful." "I won't get whisked away?" asked Murray. "Not with me to hold your paw," said Millie firmly. Murray thought for a moment, then nodded. Sharing worries always makes them feel smaller. Millie comforted as they headed for home. When the very last sandwich was eaten, Millie had a secret to share. "This is my worry box," she smiled. "When something's worrying me, I write it down, then I put it inside." "Does it make your worries disappear?" asked Murray. Not quite, said Millie. But when my worries are in the box, they don't stop me having fun. Let's make one for you. Worries won't stop me, cheered Murray, popping his worry in the box and shutting the lid tight. Ready? Millie asked. Ready, nodded Murray. Skipping along the river bank, the bears spotted dragonflies dancing above their heads. But soon the river raced faster, and there was a roar of water ahead. Nearly there, said Millie. Eek! Murray squeaked as they rounded the bend. There, sparkling in the sunlight, was the rumbling, tumbling waterfall. Wow, gasped Murray, wiping the spray from his nose. Just then, there was a shout from the rocks. It's Alfie, Millie cheered. Murray took a deep breath. Let's go and play, he decided. Last one there gets splashed. The friends were busy counting the fish when they heard a voice calling them. Yoo-hoo! Cried a rabbit Murray had never met before. It's my cousin Lara, beamed Alfie. Suddenly, Murray felt very shy. Lara scrambled to the top of the rocks. I want to go even higher, she announced, looking at an oak tree growing on the bank. Let's climb to the top of that. The friends raced off, all except Murray, who was beginning to worry. Oh dear, he sniffed. Murray wanted to join in, but his tummy felt very tight. Then he remembered. My box, he said. Quickly he scribbled down his thoughts. I'm worried that I'm not a very good climber. I'm worried that Lara won't like me. I'm worried that everyone will laugh at me. Worries won't stop me, he smiled, closing the box and trotting off to the tree. Up, 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 Murray climbed. Come higher, called Lara. You can see the sea. But Murray had spotted a hole in the trunk. There inside was a nest of fluffy owl chicks. Look what I found, Millie, he whispered. All afternoon long, the friends played until it was time to go. Oh, bother, Millie huffed. I've lost my backpack. Everyone hunted high and low till they found the backpack hidden in the reeds. Just in time, said Alfie. The sun's starting to set. Hurry, Lara squeaked in panic. We have to get home. Why? What's wrong? Asked Alfie. Lara's whiskers quivered. We won't see where we're going. We'll be late for bedtime, and I don't like the dark. Murray held Lara's paw. Sharing worries makes them feel smaller and less scary, he told her. See? I keep mine in a special box. He gave her a scrap of paper and a pencil. You can put yours in too, Murray smiled. Lara stayed by Murray's side as they walked through the wood. Follow the fireflies, Murray said. They're like night lights to show us the path. Eek! Lara squeaked as an owl hooted overhead. It's okay, whispered Murray. It's Mr. Owl saying goodnight. Across the treetops, the friends heard a hoot in reply. Soon they reached Alfie's house. Just in time for bed, Alfie beamed. Good night, everyone, said Lara. And thank you, Murray, for being such a good friend. High up on his thinking spot, Murray and Millie looked out across the valley. Thanks for showing me the waterfall, said Murray. It wasn't too big or too loud? Asked Millie. It was both, giggled Murray. But it was also great fun. I can't wait until we go again. The end. Thanks for reading along with me today.
Our speaker today is a good friend who's been with us many times before, former National Park Service interpretive ranger who's worked in a variety of fields, literally, volunteering in the Canadian Arctic, teaching night sky constellations in the Badlands of South Dakota, and guiding hikes in Oregon's Crater Lake National Park. In 2015, she launched her company Flat Hat Exhibits to bring the national park ethos into the museum world, creating inspiring exhibits that help make the world more interesting and more meaningful. She recently created an exhibit for the Women's Rights National Historical Park in Seneca Falls, New York, called Radical Optimism, the Enduring Power of the Women Who Won the Vote. And that leads us to our topic today. Please welcome Lauren Becker.
Yeah, it should be. Ooh, hi. They always train us to be able to give a talk without slides because when you first join the Park Service, their projectors are, well, at least the ones that I got to play with, were about 40 years old. And they were the legit kind, you know, remember slides, the literal slides with the plastic in between? And usually at least 50% of the time your slide projector would die in the middle of your evening program in front of 100 people in a campfire. So you had to design your talk such that it would not die with the slide projector, and you'd still be able to go forward with it. But that's not the case nowadays, which I'm really grateful for, because you know I love making pretty slides if I can. So we're here to talk about radical optimism. Yay, it worked. A different kind of technology anxiety, right? Excuse me. Can you hear me all right if I stand here? Right on. I like to be able to see you a little bit better, as you know. Thank you for coming out today again. It's nice to see you again. It's just been a few weeks. Like Keith said, this was the plan for October. I also was looking toward the upcoming election and panicking, perhaps a little bit like you. Fortunately, that didn't turn out as bad as it could have been. But I was thinking, you know, we are always talking about a lot of fun science things here. Why not take this as an opportunity to talk about women's suffrage and this exhibit? Well, y'all were doing your thing during the pandemic. I was working on this exhibit for the Seneca Falls site. I'm sure you've all been there because you're really cool people who like to travel and see neat things. So this is based on that exhibit. And it was a little bit outside of my normal subject area, as you know, but it was such a thrill to be able to work on this. But of course, the entire place there is all about wonderful women and women's suffrage. And the trick was to try to find a topic, a subject, a theme in there, a little bit different from what you were getting all around the rest of the museum. And after doing some of the research, it occurred to me that what was really coming through from this magnificent story, we know these women are fantastic. They're very strong. They're very courageous and brave and energetic and persistent. And that's all great. And I've always thought, I could never be like that. And that worried me, and it would have worried them as well, because we all need to be that way. And so I started looking for things about that maybe I could start adopting, and bits of that behavior, and trying to find a new way of looking at that story that I could hopefully tie into and continue that mission. And that's when it occurred to me that really the superpower of these women over 3 generations was definitely bravery and courage and all that, but also this incredible sense of optimism. You cannot be involved with this work without first having a sense of optimism that things can get better. And so I started to hone in on that, and it's something that I try to keep in the back of my brain and think like a suffragist as much as possible. And I'm really happy for the chance to come and hopefully share some of those stories with you. As always, this is a very complex, complicated story. It's over 80 years of time for women to finally get the vote from when they kind of started talking and thinking about it here in the United States, I should say. As always, I'm going to have to leave a lot out. Please forgive me. You could do all kinds of long seminars on this, so many books written about it. So we'll just touch on a few points, and then if you have any questions afterwards, I'd be happy to chat with you about those. I'm sure a lot of you already know some really wonderful stories and lessons from this time period, but we'll do the best we can. I promise not to go a full half hour long like I did last time. At least you don't have that delicious smell of soup tempting you away at the end. So yes, 80 years of continuous activism, pushing and pushing for this. How'd they do it? The women who fought for the vote were radical optimists, inspired by a vision of a better future and motivated by their shared purpose to make that future a reality. Now, a lot of folks generally, when they start to think women's suffrage, they hone in on the wonderful Susan B. Anthony, and for good reason. She spent the bulk of her adult life working towards this cause and was an inspiration to many. And along with general optimism, you generally have to have a lot of hope, and everybody was aware that Anthony was just this huge arc of hope that they could tap into. I love this is a sentiment that Carrie Chapman Catt said about Susan B. Anthony, not far from before Susan were to die at the turn of the 20th century. There's going to be a lot of words on these slides because I have a lot of quotes today because these women are such fantastic speakers and they're so inspirational. So, you know, I don't usually like to have a lot of words. I'm going to read them just to help in case you can't see them on the screen. Read them yourself or just close your eyes and listen to me, whatever works best. It was that hope which hoped on when others saw nothing to hope for, that splendid optimism which never knew despair, that courage which never recognized disappointment, and that tenacity of purpose which combined to make her greater than others. She never doubted that victory was ahead. And Susan is famous for the most succinct quote ever, "Failure is impossible." That is Susan B. Anthony. I think it got taken over by the Apollo program, right? In Apollo 13, Susan said it first, failure is impossible. But this is not actually when the quest for women's vote started. We need to go back a little before Susan B. Anthony to a woman named Angelina Grimke. This is her in her latter years. We don't have any photos of her in her younger days, but she started in her 30s speaking out about abolition and the connection between women's rights activists for especially suffrage really is born out of their original effort for abolition. And this was in the 1830s. So Angelina Grimke comes to mind, and we think of her as one of the sort of the start of this effort for women's rights, because at the time she was going around speaking, women just didn't do that. We forget that, but at this time period, women were literally supposed to be quiet and in the house all the time. And so Angelina and her sister Sarah were going around in the North and talking about abolition wherever they could in private meetings, usually to groups of women. It was not permitted for women to speak to mixed crowds, meaning crowds that had both men and women in them. But Angelina and these other abolitionist women realized that it couldn't be strong and effective in the abolition cause if they weren't allowed to speak to groups of people. And that cued them in. So wait a minute, so our rights, women's rights, we need these if we're also going to be able to take care of these other things that are important to us. So she was the first woman to speak before the Massachusetts State House, before a legislative body in the United States that we know of. And she was 33 when this happened in 1838. Now, fast forward 10 years, the abolition cause has been building, and we get to another big name of the suffrage story, which is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, right? And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were best friends. This is the ultimate power couple. I love this quote, "You stir up Susan and she stirs up the world," uttered by Mr. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. After once again seeing Susan in the newspapers, somebody complaining about something that Susan had been doing. And what would happen, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had lots of kids. So she couldn't be out on the road giving all these talks. So she would stay at home. Susan would come over, babysit the kids. So Elizabeth could write these fantastic speeches. She was brilliant. She came from a very intellectual family. Her father told her early on, after her brother died, that he wished she had been born a boy. And she was motivated by that for her whole life. And she learned everything she could. She was very eloquent. She would write these speeches. Susan would take them, and then off on the road she would go. Elizabeth was able early in life to travel to London with Lucretia Mott to visit a huge world conference on abolition in 1840. And since women had been talking and fighting for abolition so long in the United States, they went along with the men, fully expecting to participate in this abolitionist conference. And not only were they not allowed to participate, they couldn't even sit with the men. They were relegated to these back benches or the balcony, and they couldn't participate. Some of the men that came with them actually pulled themselves out of the conference in protest that Elizabeth Cady and Lucretia and the others couldn't participate. But this really got under their skin, and Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton started scheming and saying, I will paraphrase, this sucks, we gotta do something about it. So they get back, and this idea percolates for a while, and the whole reason we have a historic site in Seneca Falls is because in 1848, what happened there? Yes, the very first women's rights convention happened in Seneca Falls in 1848. Started by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and 4 other remarkable women. Lucretia Mott was there, Frederick Douglass was there, and they put forth a Women's Bill of Rights based on the Declaration of Independence, signed by 300 people, and off we go. Little fact check, Susan was not at that event. They didn't actually meet until a couple years later, but then they were unstoppable together. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and this group knew what they were up against, and it introduces this idea that, this is going to take some time. We have huge attitudes and huge societal hurdles we're going to have to get over. And this quote rises from Stanton when she's really confronting how hard this is going to be. Never forget that we are sowing winter wheat, which other hands than ours will reap and enjoy. This is a sentiment that we hear often in different ways. One of the ways I see it most often is the idea of planting trees that you will never see grow. This gift to the future, having the future in mind. We talked about it a lot when we were learning about Frederick Law Olmsted, who was always designing 40 years in the future to make sure that this place was going to look great. This was going to be a cozy spot for a picnic. This was going to be a beautiful tree-lined meadow. Planning ahead. So this idea that what is here now is not what's going to be in the future is central to an optimistic viewpoint and an optimistic worldview. Later on, we'll talk about Alice Paul. She was very convinced and driven by the idea, the concern that people in their time are convinced that this is the way it is. They confuse the temporal world around them as if it's something that is eternal. It has always been, it will always be. And the first thing an optimist needs to do is get rid of that mindset, because you can't be optimistic about the future if you think it can't get better and it can't change. Elizabeth Cady Stanton starts us off down this road. But speaking of difficult things to overcome, remember we talked about this movement rising up out of the abolitionist movement. The really deep, serious problems and challenges of abolition, slavery, and just outright racism. You cannot talk about the suffrage movement all these decades without also bringing that in. They are intertwined. They are the 2 hardest, most difficult rights issues of our history, really. Sojourner Truth is contemporary with our gals, Elizabeth and Susan and the other suffragists. And she was a suffragist herself, and she summarizes it pretty well here. She says, listen, if colored men get their rights and colored women not theirs, the colored men will be masters over the women, and it will be just as bad as it was before. So this is interesting. Look at the date here. Can you see that date? The date for this quote is 1867. What's going on in the United States in 1867? What's just happened and is now over? The Civil War, right. So, which was fought for states' rights, right? No, it was fought to end slavery. So we get rid of slavery. There's still lots of problems. And by 1867, we start to get the beginning of the three, what are now called the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment formally abolishes slavery, generally. The 14th Amendment, which we come to think of now as the one that really supports our idea of individual and civic rights. Sorry, it's really hard to talk about the 14th Amendment because it's very complicated. Where this is coming from is the 15th Amendment. Does anybody know what the 15th Amendment did? The 15th Amendment guarantees the right, sorry, I should back up. The 15th Amendment removes the ability of people to exclude Black people from voting. I was going to say it gives Black people the right to vote, but that's a different thing. There is no right to vote in the Constitution. All it is removing reasons why you can prevent somebody from voting. So before the 15th Amendment, you could prevent somebody from voting because they were Black. After the 15th Amendment, you can't do that, technically. We'll get to that. But so this is why Sojourner is worried, because this is the first time the male pronouns are put into the Constitution. And people concerned about women's rights are concerned because they know once that word, the male, is associated with rights and what's going on, then it's going to take 100 years to get that out of there and make it universal. And they were almost exactly right. So 1867 is a big split in the women's suffrage movement because there are a lot of women who choose to support and push for that 15th Amendment because they know that's good, and horrific things are happening to Black men still, Black people around the country, and they're hoping the vote will help with that. But there are a lot of women, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who are furious that they have just given 20 years of their lives for the abolition cause, and when it comes time to give rights to women as well, they get left out. There's a split, and then everything just kind of sort of drops. They go their separate ways. There's this lack of unity. Some people are pushing for states to grant suffrage. Some people are pushing for a federal amendment, and there's a lot of nothing happening. And we go through almost a whole generation, not to diminish that work of those women. But for the sake of this talk, we're going to jump ahead to the new infusion of blood that happens at the turn of the 20th century, and especially in the 1910s. So in 1890, the women come back together and realize this, we're not getting anywhere. We have to keep at it. We have to find new ways of doing this stuff. And they start to really push on state campaigns and trying to find ways to get attention, to get media attention. Women are more out in public now. We've had a shift in economics. More women are out and working. They're out in the world, which means they're getting some money, which means they have some economic impact. So products are being marketed to women, so we've had a big societal change. And so we now also get a shift in how the suffragists are doing their thing. Up till now, it had been conventions, writing pamphlets, sending petitions to Congress and getting nowhere. So let's start being visible with campaigns that were referred to and is still studied now as a form of what's called visual rhetoric, right? Fine, you're not going to listen to us, but we're going to make you see us, and we're going to get the message through that way. And this is a great quote. This is a group of suffrage hikers. They were also called suffrage pilgrims. This is in New York State, was one of the many states trying to fight for suffrage. By 1910, 5 states had allowed women's suffrage. They were all west of the Mississippi. The eastern part of the country was always behind on this. Rosalie Jones and Ida Craft are the leaders of this gang of merry women, and they write back. They say, "Awake, sisters, and help us. It won't do to sit back and say, yes, I think women ought to vote. We must pack up our knapsacks and say, we've got to go get it." So they were coming up in a New York referendum, and so to draw attention to it, they decide to walk from the Bronx to Albany, about 170 miles, in December. It takes them 13 days, but every town they go through, they get a publicity hit. The papers are reporting on it. They show up in Albany. They have these petitions that are signed to present. the bill fails, but still, we've got this great idea. Think of the stir this would happen in town when these ladies come through. Look at their shoes. 170 miles in December from the Bronx to Albany. Could we ever do that? Well, look, they have a little drum. Ida's not so happy. Rosalie's looking around. But look, they're singing. They're singing along to the exactly like you would expect. There's some fun happening here as well. So, as part of this letter back to the suffragists of the state, they say they're wishing you all could have had the inspiration of this pilgrimage. It was challenging, it was hard, but they also got something from it. And that's something that I've started to really try to hold on to in nurturing my own sense of optimism and that fear. This is hard, I don't think I can do that. Oh, wait, I could get a lot out of this as well as the difficulty. And that's what these women start to teach us. There was great inspiration. Look, snack time, always have to have some snacks on the road. So it turns out that this trip from Bronx to Albany was just the opening. A couple months later, in February, they decide to walk from New York City to Washington, D.C., 220 miles in the same getup, many of the same women. And why were they going to Washington, D.C., late February, early March of 1913. Anybody know? This is a huge event that really kicks off a whole new era in women's suffrage fight. This was the massive march in Washington, D.C. on March 3rd, 1913. Why did they pick this date? Guess what's happening the very next day on March 4th? This is such perfect planning. Woodrow Wilson is being inaugurated. So you have all of the press in the country, much of the press around the world, thousands of people coming to DC for Wilson's inaugural. The day before, good old Alice Paul and the Suffrage Association decides, we're gonna have a parade, we're gonna have a procession, we're gonna take advantage of all your people, and we're going to do our visual rhetoric like it's never been seen before. They estimate that probably 10,000 people participated in the procession, and hundreds of thousands of people were all around. It was, can you imagine, you see pictures of this. It's like when you see pictures of the Pan Am in 1901 in Buffalo and you just wish you could have been there. This was a huge deal. So you had state and international delegations from all over the world, senators and congressmen who were supportive of suffrage, many from the West. Professional groups, so you had walking the nurses, you'd have the teachers, there was a group of social workers all coming together in specific colors. It was highly organized. Alice Paul pulled this off in less than 3 months, right? Okay, that's inspirational. College clubs, Bryn Mawr, all these wonderful women's schools, floats, bands. The suffrage pilgrims had completed their 220-mile journey. The pageantry of it. I mean, think of the difference in the imagery we get from sort of the old maids like Susan B. Anthony being the face of suffrage, and now this is the face of suffrage. We have good old Inez Milholland, who was well known and known to be just thought of as beautiful. She was a lawyer. She could also really handle a horse well, so she was off at the front of the column. And then at the end of the march was scheduled to be this beautiful tableau on the steps of the Treasury building with Liberty and Columbia coming out to stress all these high ideals that the women were aiming for, tying their crusade to the American crusade for liberty and rights. Some of the college groups were actually these suffrage groups that had started to form in many of the historic Black colleges. So the first Delta Sigma Theta group founded at Howard was there. Remember we were talking about how it's really difficult to separate suffrage and racism? So even though women's rights are in the air, this parade had an undercurrent of that happening. Are we gonna allow the Black women to march along with the white women? Well, we have white women from southern states here who and they were gonna walk out if the Black women were allowed to walk along with the white women. How do you deal with that? It's a very ugly side of this otherwise remarkable event. I love these outfits. This is the homemaker unit of the procession. This ended up going really sideways though, because those hundreds of thousands of men who were in town for the Wilson inauguration, got a little drunk the day before and saw this parade going in, and they shut it down. And what should have taken 45 minutes to go from start to finish to the Treasury building took over 3 hours. The police were useless. They had to call out the National Guard, which Alice Paul anticipated and had them waiting nearby so they could come bring the horses. The men just completely encased the women in the streets. There were dozens of injuries. Women had to be taken to the hospital. There was an inquiry afterwards. Some of the policemen involved had been also pushing and shoving the women and tripping them and harassing them. Meanwhile, remember, this is cold, early March. See these outfits they're in? They're expecting the parade and everything to start 45 minutes. It's 3 hours later. They're still out here wondering where the parade is. It ended up being a huge publicity win, though. The papers were talking about this for weeks afterwards. So this was a big deal. So let's do more of them. So the following year, they have groups in all the states deciding to show unity by having their own parades in their own states on the same day. And then they bring more petitions to Washington, D.C. again. The women go through all of this. They walk up the steps of the Capitol with all of their petitions. Only 11 senators come out to meet them. Not the reception they want. Again, it's kind of a blank at the end of the event, but it was in the press for a week. And that was the idea. Had to get that word out, had to get that publicity. This is from 1915. This is August 7th. So all the states had these referenda that the women were working towards for the state strategy. So women from Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey sent a torch of liberty. How ironic that our great Statue of Liberty is a woman in a country where women don't have liberty and can't vote. So they tour this thing around the 3 states, and then in this wonderfully symbolic gesture, they meet in the middle of the Hudson to pass the torch from New Jersey to New York. And it's successful, except the referendum is still failed. Again, disappointment, defeat. How do they keep going? Let's come up with another thing. Okay, fine. There's the big World's Fair in 1915 is in San Francisco. So they go out, they set up a booth, and they start collecting petitions. Now, this is a huge event, so they have lots of potential signatures to get. They collect over 500,000 signatures on a petition. You know, they have a big piece of paper, people are signing it. When that piece of paper is full, they glue it to the previous one, and then they glue another piece of it. This makes a really long petition, over 3 miles long, this petition. They roll up the big thing, they drop it in a car and send these 3 women driving from San Francisco back to DC. It takes over 3 months. And there's a procession waiting for them, of course, because we have to welcome this thing. The press and the media has been following them everywhere they go, every town. They're making speeches, they're passing out leaflets, this is what you should do. I love it. These are the 2 drivers, can you tell? This is Sarah Bardfield, she's from Oregon. These 2 women are from New Jersey. They had come out to the state fair, saw this really great car, and decided to buy it. And in swoops the suffragists. They're like, you know, you got to drive that thing back across the country. If you let us put this massive 3-mile-long petition in the back and a banner on the side, this could be really great. Well, of course, they were suffragists too, and they said, yes, let's do it. So they come all the way across the country, go up to the steps of the Capitol, and there's nobody there. They don't let them in, and then they try to meet with President Wilson. He's like, you know, I never really thought that much about the suffrage issue before. Right, but again, a huge publicity win. So these were deputations when they would send these groups of suffragists in to talk to President Wilson, in to talk to Congress members. And Retta Child Dorr, who was the editor for their newspaper, their weekly newspaper called The Suffragist for a long time, she referred to these deputations as drops of water which we hoped would finally make an impression on the stone. This is that optimism again, isn't it? We've all seen the Grand Canyon. We know what happens if you have water over and over and over again working on a hard stone. She continues to talk about how the stone she's talking to is actually President Wilson. But he was unmoved. He was not a nice person. I'll just leave that there. That's another talk. Okay, so that car going across the country was so successful, Alice Paul decides, great, we're going to send a whole train across the country and hit all these different, and do the same thing. So this is the deputation. There were 23 of these envoys, and they stopped at all these different cities. They had worked ahead and with all of their contacts and their organizations, the state organizations, planned all of these speaking gigs. They spent 39 days touring the Western suffrage states. How glorious would that be? So we're talking about it's a lot of hard work. You need a lot of courage and a lot of bravery, but you get this fantastic train ride around the country to all these fantastic sites. And off they go to bond this unity with the suffrage states of the West and the non-suffrage states of the East. Well, yeah, so then it starts to get really exciting. What else can we do to get attention? This is Lucy Burns, who had gotten fed up with them never listening to the words. So she has this idea, if we can only express ourselves through action, fine. This is that rhetorical, visual rhetoric. And so as part of, she's on this train ride, this train trip, they're in Seattle for a while, and they get the idea, there's a big convention happening in Chicago later that year. So they have all these flyers, and she goes and she finds this pilot in the seaplane, and she grabs thousands of these flyers, and they're gonna go up in this plane and fly around Seattle, and she's gonna bomb these flyers out the window. It's horrible from a littering standpoint. We have a different, but she does this, and it's really fantastic because, you know, on the one hand, was she scared? And people asked, how did you do this? And well, the banner she had immediately flew away in the 80-mile-an-hour wind going by. But I love this quote. She says, I forgot all about suffrage and votes for women in that wonderful experience. So she was just like, screw it, this is awesome. And she's flying around. She wasn't the only one. They did a lot of these kinds of stunts. I mean, think about what air travel was like at this time period, right? This is the 19-teens. We get another remarkable. This is basically a Wright flyer, okay? Look how exposed these two women are. This is the pilot, Lita Richburg Hornsby, and her buddy Ida Blair, who is a social worker and a businesswoman, and they have the same idea. They also are going to drop leaflets, bombs out the plane. But what they're trying to do, so they had just decided to and installed new lighting, the first lighting for the Statue of Liberty. So it's going to be this huge ceremony on the island, and extravagant lights to light up the statue. So of course, President Wilson is going to be there. He's going to come on his yacht, the Mayflower, just so absurd. He's going to come on his yacht, right? Can you imagine the Pilgrims? You call that a Mayflower? So they get the idea, fine, we're gonna photobomb Wilson on his yacht. So they take off from Staten Island in this biplane in December, right? Look what they're wearing. The newspapers, like, they had every layer on that all, you know, flybirds, you know, will wear. So off they go, and it almost works. The gale force winds coming down the Hudson were so strong, they had to make an emergency landing in a swamp on Staten Island. They broke the wings of the plane, but they ended up being okay. So again, would you be able to do brave, courageous? Do you think they imagined a year before that they would be doing anything like this? Probably pretty exciting. You always have a great story to tell. So the short version is this: Alice Paul's National Women's Party, and then Carrie Chapman Catt's NASA. This is the National American Women's Suffrage Association. These are kind of two organizations that are kind of playing good cop, bad cop for the suffrage, the last decade, 2 decades of the suffrage movement. But all of these things they're doing brought such skills to these women that they couldn't have gotten anywhere else. Imagine the training and the skill set they're getting. In person, door to door, on foot, in the middle of exhausting work, these women found camaraderie, self-respect, and personal fulfillment in their fight to win the vote. I love this. This is Mabel Vernon. Look at this crowd of men. Look, there's a reason I don't zoom in on her when I put these pictures in. Look at the faces on these men as Mabel's trying to talk. How brave do you have to be to stand up? How far have we come since Angelina Grimke, right? In 1838, not being allowed to talk to a mixed crowd. Here we are. It's pretty amazing. And once you find the courage to do this, look at this. Then they find they can do almost anything, which is good because they're going to need that courage going forward. All of these efforts do not work. And we hit a pitch point on one of these tours. Remember Inez Milholland, the beautiful lawyer on that white steed in the 1913 march? She had persistent anemia that was undiagnosed, and she was in the middle of a barn-raising speech in Los Angeles in 1916 and collapsed on the stage. And she made it a month after that, and then she died at the age of 30. So in many ways now the movement had a martyr. And again, always trying to use everything possible for the cause, and convinced that Inez would have wanted it this way because she had given her life for this cause. They send a whole new round of envoys and deputations into Congress, and especially into President Wilson, to say, come on, enough. And again, they are rebuked. On January 9th, 1917, Wilson basically says again, no. The very next day, Alice Paul sends out the very first of what would become 2 years of silent sentinels, women picketing the White House. The very first ever picket line in front of the White House was done by these women, starting in January 1917. They basically just stood there. They were called the silent sentinels because they did not talk. They had flags and banners. That was their weapons, these militant suffragists. And then they started to put some words on the banners. Now, again, courageous, but also, this is kind of new. I'm here with my friends. We've just spent years going through these other adventures. Let's see how this goes. It's January in DC, not as cold as it is here, but still not very pleasant. Look closely at this fantastic image. Library of Congress has phenomenal records for these things if you want to look up any of that. Look, do you see them standing on boards and on top? What do you think why do you think that is? What do you think that's about? Exactly, to keep your feet separate from the cement. So Alice Paul, in her wisdom, had rented the great big house across the street from the White House. So there were these regular refreshments and also reinforcements coming over. So they're over across the street heating up bricks in the fireplace, and they bring them over and they stand them on the blocks on the ground so the women can stand on these heated bricks. They had a set of fur coats. Most of these women were middle to upper class, so they had some money, good coats, but they also had a set of coats. You would come in for your volunteer shift, take the fur coat from whoever was just out there, put it on, and off you'd go for your shift. Through all kinds of weather. They were out there 6 days a week, basically from 9 to 5, no matter what. They only took off Sundays. And again, a bit of a challenge, but again, talk about a team building exercise, and you're sharing this experience with your friends. And that is a good feeling to counteract all of the awful stuff you have to put up with. Pickets symbolized a positive change in women's ethos, enabling them to take their own needs seriously instead of just adhering to the priorities of a male-governed nation. I love this quote, Florence Brewer Becker, this is her right here. She says, "This was the last protest against the tradition that women can be counted upon to give all and demand nothing." That's quite a change in what is expected of women at the time. So, picketing brought together women into a shared experience of strength and risk, and that builds long-lasting friendships and relationships and camaraderie. Now, why is it risky now? So there's a lot that can be seen and understood from this image. So first of all, before it was winter, they're standing on boards, they have the foot. What do you notice, what they're wearing, what time of year do you think this is? It's warmer now, right? They have hats. We have a Navy sailor over here. Who is this guy? Can you tell who this fellow is? He's a policeman. See his badge? He has his hand on his billy club, right? Look at the expressions on these faces. Look at the angry men behind them. This one is she was kind of the den mother, who you see her in a lot of these photos of the women at the pickets. Oh, she was there, obviously, their handler to take care of them, make sure she has her hands very tightly and carefully on these two women who are doing their best to stay silent with their flags. This one is casting a wary glance this way. Here's a kid with a rock in his hand. It's taken a turn. What happened in world events in the spring of 1917? The war had been going on, but now the United States is in. Now, in the Civil War, the suffragists had decided to pull back from the suffrage fight and just focus on the Civil War stuff. That seemed like the patriotic thing to do. And a lot of people believed that set suffrage back three 3 decades, a whole generation by doing that. Alice Paul wasn't going to stop. So even though the United States had entered World War I, she still has her pickets out there. But not only that, she starts putting stuff on signs, calling Wilson a hypocrite, and basically saying, how dare you go and stand before the world and say America is fighting for democracy in this war in Europe, when half of our own country is not democratic. We don't have our rights. We can't even vote. So they start putting this on the banners, and that really starts making people mad. So they start to get arrested. The first arrests were in June of 1917. And they realize now that when they ask volunteers to go out on the picket line, they need people who are willing to get arrested. So Catherine Morey, who was a upper middle class socialite from New York, gets this letter from Alice Paul, and Alice is like, what do you think about coming down? And she says, all right, then we will have to have people willing to be arrested, and I will come down and I will be one. And that gives me chills every time I see that quote. And she's not the only one who says stuff like this. I understand awful things are going to happen. I'm going to come down there and I will be one of them. She wasn't alone. These are portraits of only 40 of the over 150 women who were arrested and served time in prison for basically standing on a sidewalk and holding a banner, being militant suffragists. Even with this consequence, they kept at it for over 2 years, nearly every day. This act of protesting and also spending time in prison strengthened their bonds, and it also gave them more courage and earned them all kinds of respect from the rest of the country, because again, the media is following this. The conditions in prison were awful. They had tried to get political prisoner status, which meant a very gentler treatment. You got real food, you could wear normal clothes, but they were kept in prison, both the regular DC prison and then the workhouse in Occoquan, which weirdly is only a few miles from where I grew up, and I had no idea of this history. It's in Northern Virginia, right outside of DC. There's a wonderful new museum there now. It's no longer a workhorse. And another talk, we'll talk about how this Occoquan workhouse was actually a project of TR when he was trying to reform, TR meaning Teddy Roosevelt, when he was trying to reform the awful prison system. So off they are, and it's still, they just keep going. Lucy Burns, who we saw in a plane earlier, remember? She and Catherine Morey were the first two who were arrested, and Lucy was the one who ended up spending the most time in jail than any other suffragist in America. This is a long time to be in jail, and she was there dealing with the maggots in the food, the horrific conditions, just being sick, and as it happened to the suffragists in England, trying to protest for this political prisoner stance. Alice Paul and Lucy actually had met when they were working with the Pankhurst in England for British women's suffrage, and they would go on hunger strikes as a protest to the treatment they were receiving. And of course, they were then force-fed because the prison people couldn't have a death on their hands of a suffragist from a hunger strike. Alice and Lucy brought that form of protest back and used that in the United States as well, so they were force-fed. And then they would go back out and picket again. The very next day, there's a woman named Alice Turnbull Hopkins. She's in and she goes through all this, and Wilson gives her a pardon, and out she goes. She's like, I didn't want a pardon. The very next day, she goes out by herself with a new sign, paraphrasing, I don't want your pardon, I want liberty and justice for women, you by herself after being in jail. So Lucy is in prison the night of what came to be known the Night of Terror. These women were in doing these protests and the hunger strikes. And the leaders of the prison decided the superintendent wasn't gonna have it anymore. So he ordered the guards, 40 guards, to start beating the women, essentially. And this was the night of November 14th into November 15th of 1917, the night of terror. There were about 31 women in prison, and they were all beaten by these guards, very rough-handled. Lucy was beaten and then handcuffed with her arms above her head and hung from the top of the jail overnight, left that way. Other women were thrown into their cells and bashed against the iron beds repeatedly. A woman had a heart attack because she thought her cellmate had been killed by one of these bashings into the iron. The memory for me that stands out from Lucy, remember Lucy has been kind of the den mother and with these women for many, many years. She knows who's in those jail cells and what has just happened. And she is stuck there in that cell and spends the night calling out the names of the other women, asking how they're doing and making sure they reply back and to keep them going through that awful, awful night. This, our Lucy Burns. I like to hope that somewhere in the middle of that awful night, she had a spot in her memory when she could go back and recall those glorious days flying in that airplane or traveling on that train and leading those women in this great, great cause that they were so devoted to. You have to have something to make it worth it to endure the hard, hard stuff, but always, always optimism. Fast forward 3 years more of this kind of activism, and it finally worked. There's a whole series of events that had to happen, massive amount of effort at the state level to finally get the Senate and the House to send the bill up. And then, of course, it has to be ratified by 36 states to become an amendment. And at the very last, you may know the story of good old Harry Burns in Tennessee changes his vote from no to yes after getting a letter from his mother, Feb, saying, and he had it in his pocket, it's not apocryphal, it's actually happened, saying, be good to Miss Cat, and let's do that for women. Changes his vote, Tennessee comes on board, and finally the amendment, the 19th Amendment, is pushed through. And this is the cover, not at that moment, but just a little bit before it finally gets out of Congress. Then it almost always makes me cry. Because after all this, over 80 years, finally, Carrie Chapman Catt addresses the next convention. Be glad today, let your joy be unconfined, let it find its way into the soul of every woman of any and every race and nationality who is yearning for the opportunity and liberty still denied her sex. At last. Elaine Weiss has a remarkable book called The Woman's Hour, which happily Steven Spielberg has optioned, so I hope it will be a movie before too long, all about that battle in Tennessee for that last push. And it really sums it up. Everything the cause had accomplished was once impossible. Not to Susan B. Anthony, failures of the once impossible, until it wasn't. And it's important here to, we're talking about optimism, we're talking about hope. This wasn't faith, this was active optimism. All of these women standing up, I will go down and I will do it, I will be the one. When you look at the full quote of Susan B. Anthony, what she says before the failure is impossible, she is looking around at a meeting. She's not long before death. This is in the early 1900s, and all of these suffragists have gotten together to honor her and thank her for her work. And she's standing up there and has to say a few remarks at the end. And she's struggling a bit, and she's looking around, she's just thanking the women to her right and her left. And she wishes she could thank everybody, there are just too many. And she says, standing around, looking at all these remarkable women, I know that failure is impossible because of these women who are carrying that torch into the Hudson and across over to New York to carry this work forward, the future optimists, to take care of that. It was impossible until it wasn't. How'd they do it? They held true to that conviction that problems could be solved if they could join together and do the work. Radical optimism powered these generations of suffragists. And I think it can help power us too. We have to keep at it, because it turns out that people who think the world can change for the better usually end up changing the world for the better. So hopefully you found something in here that's going to keep you going a bit. I highly recommend, if you haven't ever, please give lots of work and attention to these marvelous women and these phenomenal stories. I think the challenge and the struggle will boost you in these difficult times that we can find ourselves. Thank you.
Please stand at the mic.
Yes, of course. Right, sorry. Does anybody have any questions?
I have one.
Hey.
So any big issue like that in this day and age will instantly become polarized, and one political party will hate it and one will love it. But where was the opposition coming from? I realized that Democrats and Republicans weren't the same parties then that they were now, but was one party leaning more in favor of it and one was diametrically opposed at the time?
That's a really good question. Did y'all hear it okay? So I don't need to repeat it. In general, there was no party that was for or against suffrage across the board, even taking into account the kind of flip in ideologies between the Democratic and Republican Party around the turn of the century a little bit later. It was all a matter of expediency and power. So much the same way that people, the Republicans and the people in the North were for Black people and ex-slaves, former enslaved people getting the vote, is because they knew that if the Black men could vote, they would vote for Republicans because the Republicans pushed for their freedom. Women were a different story. One of the reasons why these two issues were so entwined is that you had the whole Southern contingency and you had a bunch of women, and we know that women don't vote as a block, right? We don't all feel the same way about things. And so there was great concern about enfranchising all the Southern women, and their votes would counterbalance all of the votes the Republicans just gained from the Black men. And then what do? Well, the Black women could vote, and then so it gets complicated there. When you get to the turn of the century, the biggest struggle that the suffragists had, and it took them a while to figure out where this opposition was coming from, because it was always a lot of money to oppose, and faulty ballots, lots of tricks and bribery and horrible stuff, were coming from a couple different sources. One, the liquor lobby, right? So people were worried, men were worried that if women were allowed to vote, they would vote for temperance. And a huge portion, the suffrage movement was big, but the biggest women's movement ever was the temperance movement. And that's happening about the same time. And so they were worried that if women got the vote, then alcohol would become illegal. And so think of the money behind the liquor lobby, right? So that was often something they were up against. They were also up against general industry, because if women can vote, all of a sudden they're going to say they don't want to work 16 hours a day anymore, and they'll vote for labor laws for children and women, and that will interfere with our profits, so we can't have that. So there was a whole bunch of money against those things. So the women had to become very politically savvy and figuring out the power structures. One of the chips that had to fall that allowed for the success when it did was the temperance people won. Right? So we got the amendment that did ban alcohol, got through Congress in 1917. And so I think the liquor lobby was like, well, screw it. It doesn't matter if they vote now, we already have temperance. So that pulled some of that off. But it was never the same thing, and nobody was consistently in favor. You did get TR and the New Progressive Party in 1912, and they had a very active, strong platform in favor of women's suffrage, but we know how that turned out. Great question. Yes.
So there was a history, like in the civil rights movement in the 60s, a lot of religious groups kind of got behind civil rights protests. Were there any religious groups that were supporting or were against suffrage?
So in case you didn't hear that question, yeah.
Repeat the question for the Zoom.
Yeah, and make sure that I heard you correctly. So basically, were religious groups in favor of or against suffrage kind of over the course of this? For the most part, religious groups to the regular, normal leaning to conservative were always against women's suffrage, because most religious folks believed that the woman's place was in the home. And there was a really great concern that women who were seen as the moral foundation of the family and therefore the nation, if you throw them into amoral and often immoral politics, that was a mashup that shouldn't happen, and it would corrupt both things. They didn't want morality in politics, but they also didn't want political stuff coming back and messing up the morals of women. Eventually you do get some, and the Unitarians, and especially the Quakers, were very much in favor of this ideal of equality, and that certainly reflected it. So Alice Paul was raised Quaker. Many of the women involved in the suffrage movement had a Quaker background, and that the Quaker habit of witnessing, of standing up, like picking your issue. What is your life's issue going to be? What cause are you going to witness for? Alice Paul chose suffrage, and that idea of literally standing up, your physical presence being part of your argument and your witness for a cause. So those are the two that come to mind, but generally everybody else was against it. And still are. No offense, but a lot of you look like you probably remember Phyllis Schlafly and a lot of the fights over the ERA and some of the conservative stuff. And I mean, that continues to this day. And a lot, the stuff that we're finding now, pushing back against women's rights, especially related to abortion and some of those other things, are absolutely motivated by, let's just call it, this idea of Christian nationalism that is pulling in religious people who absolutely want to mix religion and politics and feel morally required to do so. But it's all about power. Good questions. I love this. Thanks. You got stuff you got to do, though.
We could probably wrap it.
Yes, okay. Thanks, you guys.
All right. Thanks, Lauren. Please meet us in the lobby for refreshment and further conversation after the service, and we'll extinguish the chalice and listen to Jenny play the postlude after. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Thanks, everyone. Have a great Sunday.